After a whole long season, the Stanley Cup Finals are almost here. Find out who's going to be facing off in what should be a fun matchup on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, more than anything, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode got a couple of fun topics to talk about. Obviously, we're going to be previewing the Cup Final between Edmonton and Florida in just a little bit. Also wanted to talk about two things that came up. Blake Wheeler is kind of hanging it up, and I think I got some surprisingly interesting feedback on Twitter about whether or not the Jets should sign him for a day and perhaps bring him back for a bit of a farewell. And sort of on a related note, one other thing I thought about is how close or how far are the Jets really from being a competitive team? And it's a tougher question with this roster because, quite honestly, I think you've got two arguments that could be very valid. So we'll get to all of that in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, the Jets are not in the playoffs, but perhaps they have a bit of a representative in the Stanley Cup Finals in former Jets coach Paul Maurice. He has led the Panthers all the way to yet another Cup Finals. And before you say it, he was not going to do this with the Jets. I know a lot of people have perhaps tried to have some revisionist history, but let's be real. When Maurice left the Jets, it was clear that not only had the team basically ignored him at this point, but he basically just sort of lost any sense of how to fix what was wrong with Winnipeg. When he walked and left, I mean, the team was pretty much in a smoldering ash pile. So what he's doing with the Panthers is a little bit bittersweet. I'm not going to root against him, but it is kind of frustrating that, not in a sense that I dislike him or hate him on a personal level, but it just sucks that, here is somebody who, walked away from his team after he basically admitted he had no idea how to fix the biggest problems with the team, and then immediately gets rewarded with a couple of Cup Finals. Just sort of pisses me off in I guess I wish we were the Panthers kind of way, but I mean, it is what it is. Florida is a better, more well-built team than the Jets are, unfortunately. And so I suppose we should have expected that, so long as Maurice trusts the way his team plays, they're going to be pretty decent like the Jets were a few years ago when Maurice led them to the conference finals. But again, not to sound salty, but it does just irritate me slightly because it really should have been Winnipeg, all those years ago to have multiple seasons where, the Jets were a true powerhouse contender. But it is what it is. You can't go back in time. All I'll say is, there's no gotcha there. Having Maurice, if we had kept him on to this point, we would have been stuck in the same position we've been for the last few years of, limited playoff success, unfortunately. So, as far as this playoff series is concerned, this Cup Finals is interesting because you've got a unique matchup, and with the Oilers kind of coming into this, not looking like a particularly strong team in a couple of key areas, you have a very interesting clash of styles. The Oilers have kind of gotten through the postseason because Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl decided enough is enough. We're taking this team to a Cup Finals. They have combined for one of the greatest playoff runs from a pair of players ever, and you add on Evan Bouchard having a really strong playoffs as well, and Stuart Skinner finally starting to stop pucks. And I don't want to say that the Oilers are a one-line team or something, but I think a lot of their success this postseason has really, driven through just a couple of players. It's fascinating because on the one hand, there have been some really good pickups like Ekholm and stuff like that, but on the other hand, the overall roster still has a lot of the Ken Holland fingerprints, which is to say it's not great past a certain point. And I think there were moments where Dallas very clearly outplayed the Oilers by a fair margin, but because McDavid is McDavid, it didn't matter. Against the Panthers, I think that might be a situation where that could change. Now, the biggest thing for the Panthers is they can't really take penalties, and they're going to have to be careful every time McDavid steps on the ice. Let's be real. Like, the Stars were a phenomenal cup contender, and Edmonton's duo of top players basically undressed them on a handful of shifts and won a series. It's a little bit reductionist to put it that way, but I think it's very fascinating that when you think about how the Oilers have gotten to this point, while, there are players like Hyman and Kane and a few others who have definitely contributed to the overall success, so much of it has really just been McDavid and Draisaitl leading the way. And I'm curious to know how that matches up against Barkov, Reinhart, a really talented, great, and deep team in the Panthers. You've got the rising star of Lindell and a few others. The blue line is considerably better in a lot of areas too. And so, with a really well-balanced approach versus a team that is like supremely top-heavy, but like that top-heavy just happens to be a couple of the best players in the whole league, you have, again, a fascinating matchup. I would say that I still think the Panthers probably come through on this one, but I'm open to being wrong because so far McDavid and Draisaitl have just done basically everything to surprise and shock us all. They've had one of the best playoffs I've ever seen from a couple of guys, and if you're talking about players who have proven that, maybe at times the league can be a little more NBA-like in having superstar talents that can just take over a game, maybe McDavid is finally moving that needle, because traditionally this sport has been about how deep your team is rather than just a key couple of players. Not that those don't play a role, but obviously, their time on the ice is relatively controlled and limited. But McDavid kind of upsets that balance, and he's been on a bit of a warpath. I guess if I'm rooting for a team, I guess I would probably go with the Panthers. I don't think the Canadian connection really feels particularly strong. I can never really root for an Oilers Cup. So I guess I'll root for Paul Maurice to maybe get a ring. Again, like I said, there's something slightly bittersweet about that. Quite honestly, I think my easiest approach is just not to root for anyone. If I just play more of a neutral role, I'll feel better about it. But I'd be curious to know if you're actually rooting for Maurice, or maybe you are hoping Canada's Cup finally arrives through the Oilers. I'd personally think it's way funnier if they don't win it. And also, I can't bring myself to root for an Alberta team, right? It just doesn't feel right. But curious to know how you feel about that. Drop your thoughts and comments in the below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Now, focusing back on some Jets news, and perhaps more in the past than anything, wanted to spend a moment talking about the interesting news that Blake Wheeler might be considering hanging up the skates and whether or not the Jets should celebrate his legacy as a Winnipeg player. We'll get into all of that in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at FanDuel. It's winner-take-all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Maybe you're betting on McDavid to finally end not only Canada's Cup curse, but also an Edmonton Oilers Cup drought. Or perhaps you think that the Panthers, with their well-balanced approach and great versatility, are going to take Paul Maurice back to another Cup final and get him a ring, which he unfortunately could not do with the Jets. Love that. But, regardless of whatever team you think is going to be the one to hoist the Stanley Cup, if you're a new customer to FanDuel, you can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. This is your chance to cast some player predictions from either the Oilers or Panthers, or maybe even give your series prediction, all with FanDuel.com. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us as we're just about to talk about a fun one on tonight's episode. Not necessarily fun in, looking towards the future, but perhaps a fun little conversation that kind of came out of, well, some interesting controversy that I saw on Twitter about potentially celebrating Blake Wheeler's legacy as a Jets player. Surprisingly, a little more mixed, although I suppose with how his career in Winnipeg kind of ended, perhaps a little more understandable that some folks aren't as in love with him as they used to be. Before we dive into which side of the fence I would personally sit on, just want to let you know that all of you Fox or ESPN watchers, if you find yourselves having to turn down the volume because of all the shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, earlier today, I kind of tweeted about, for me, Blake Wheeler deserves to come back, sign a one-day contract, and retire a Jet. That got some interesting pushback. And of course, this is all off of the news that Wheeler is kind of mulling retirement. I know he did play one final game with the Rangers there in the playoffs, and there was some conversation about whether or not he comes back next season, especially after kind of feeling like his career perhaps maybe had some unfinished business. But he said, quite honestly, he's thinking about just hanging it up. His family at home needs him. His kids need him. And so I kind of feel like Wheeler has just about accomplished as much as he's wanted to do outside of getting like a major ring or something. I think he would love to kind of close that chapter and get it. But, by the same token, he's like, 36, 37, maybe a little bit younger than that. I think at where he's, kind of thinking at this stage of his career, he knows that his hockey days are probably getting close to the end there. And it's really about, making the most of that time with your family and catching up on time that you've already missed, right? He's been away, on and off over the past few years. And I think at this point, settling down and being there for your kids and your wife is probably a pretty good decision to make. And I don't think anyone could hold it against him if he decided to end it here. Nor could they hold it against him, I suppose, if he decided to play one more year. But I kind of think, given how he described the whole situation, he's already made his choice. So usually when somebody says it in those terms, they kind of know that they want to hang it up. So very interesting decision. But I mentioned that I thought it was worth, him coming back for one day and ending his career as a Jet. And I know like a lot of people have very mixed feelings. And I think the way that his Jets tenure ended really soured his legacy in Winnipeg. And I have a couple of thoughts about that. For one thing, I don't disagree. I think that the way that he walked out of the locker room and kind of left it a toxic mess absolutely does sit on his shoulders. He was a captain who unfortunately got into some real tough stuff with both, the younger players and even at times some of the veterans. And, there were, moments of alienation that have probably pushed away a couple of key young players that the Jets had planned to build around. And so that part of his legacy obviously sucks. And that's not something that's ever going to go away. The other part of me, though, looks at what he did, before then. And the guy was like a Winnipeg Jet through and through. That man would play through almost every single injury possible. He even, towards the end of his, Jets tenure, played through a ruptured testicle. If you want to talk about a guy who fought for the badge, and honestly, perhaps his greatest sin was just wanting to give too much of himself to Winnipeg, that's the kind of guy that I always felt he was. I think he sometimes had some Rick Bonus in him and that he was a little stubborn and wanted to win his way. And sometimes it was hard to convince him that perhaps that way wasn't the best. And that's kind of where I think the real sticking point was, is he wanted to be that guy for the Jets, even when his body was starting to fail him and paint him more into like a depth role. But, with the contract that he had and the C that he wore on his chest, I'm sure that had a lot to do with it. I'm sure he felt like it was his obligation and duty to fill that role and become, a major leader, not only in the room, but on the ice. And he wanted to live up to that. But, for all of his faults, when Wheeler was in his prime, he was an unheralded monster. The guy could, drive results from a position that traditionally you don't see a lot of wingers just take over games. But Wheeler had the ability to just really dominate offensive zone possession, create beautiful goals off the rush. And when he was giving us some of his best seasons, that guy was an unholy terror. Really, it's a shame that we didn't get that Blake Wheeler towards the end of his career. Obviously, I think his back and perhaps some of his lower body stuff started to catch up to him. Age was definitely a thing. And so it's a shame, right? But I'll always kind of look back fondly on some of his best years. And to me, I think that he gave enough to the team to deserve, one final farewell and send-off. He was a guy who I thought really represented the Jets franchise well. He was pretty beloved in the community and seemed to be pretty involved. And, I just, for all of the things that happened at the end of his Jets tenure, I don't know if that clouds it enough for me to not want to celebrate his time in the NHL. I think he was a great player for the city. I think he was a really cool ambassador. And there were moments where he made some really outspoken statements and stuff that I thought, I wouldn't, call it like super courageous, but I think it was really great that he used his platform and his voice to express some positive sentiments and things. And so, for me, I'll always kind of look fondly on him. I think, for all of my frustrations, and I had plenty of them that I put out there on social media and stuff, I would still love to have him back for one more day, just to say farewell and thanks for all of the stuff that he did for the Jets. He was a great player. I think he was, at times a great captain. And it's just a shame the way that it ended. I think it could have been handled a lot differently, but, maybe time and experience has taught him that. And it seems like since moving to the Rangers, things maybe changed a little bit for how he saw his role on the team. So, interesting food for thought there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you kind of sit in the camp where you feel the Jets shouldn't bring him back for that? Do you dislike what he did to the point of that kind of being your lasting memory? Or are you more in the camp where I'm kind of sitting where, for all of his faults, you still love him and you still saw him as the guy for a very long time? I'd be curious to know and would love to hear your thoughts, whether you post them down below in the comments or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Let me know. I would love to hear it. But kind of moving on from the past and perhaps the Wheeler conversation, one last thing that I thought would be worth talking about is a really tough question. And that's how close, or in some, depending on how you ask, how far are the Jets from being a real contender again? I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit because I think this is probably one of the hardest questions to answer and perhaps why this summer might be one of the most pivotal in the franchise's history. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just closing out with a couple of thoughts on a major question that I think has come up on and off on Twitter and elsewhere, perhaps even in the comments below. There's been a question of how far are the Jets really from being competitive? And I've waffled on this personally a lot. I go back and forth a lot on a couple of different thought processes because honestly, I don't know. For me, the Jets are kind of in a weird spot that you'd almost describe as like a hockey limbo. They're neither bad enough to really tank and rebuild, but they're not good enough to be in that upper tier and echelon of truly elite playoff teams. They are most certainly a playoff team. There is zero question about that. Perhaps next season could be a bit of a different story. But past couple of years, right, they have generally been a playoff team. Whether you think that's because they're actually strong or because they have some great individual performers like Hellebuyck that have carried them through, that's certainly up for debate. Past season, they were just a great team, and unfortunately, they had a couple of key weaknesses and some coaching decisions that ultimately got exposed. This upcoming year, for one thing, I think the roster is going to look pretty different. I think the Jets are likely to make a couple of big changes to the team, and that's why I'm really struggling with this question, because depending on how the summer goes, they may opt to perhaps sacrifice the competitive window and start looking ahead towards the future. I don't feel that this is the exact direction the Jets want to go. I would imagine that they're trying to push and sort of play both sides, where they make a competitive playoff push, but still bring in the youth. If they go that route, I kind of feel like I would say they're a little further away than they might think. It would have to be a big smash hit offseason where Chevy acquires a top 6 center and a top 4 defender before I start to feel like the Jets are in a more competitive state. I think Winnipeg is very much in the category of being a team that could very well make the playoffs and perhaps even is likely to, but how far do you really think you're going to go in the postseason? That, I think, is unfortunately the biggest sticking point. And like, you've even seen Colorado and Dallas, which were better teams, get ousted before making the Cup Finals. So, just imagine how brutal that is, and then look at what happened to the Jets in the first round against Colorado. You feel like that gap might be a little insurmountable, but it's not. I think it really rides on two things for this season. The first is what happens with the kids, right? Heinola, Lambert, Chibrikov, what sort of seasons do they have? Are they going to have big years for the Jets? Are they going to be more modest performers? I think those guys have the potential to really shift Winnipeg's fates, because they really do upgrade a couple of key positions for the Jets. And, it also kind of hinges on if Lambert's replacing Ehlers or is supplementing him. And this, the second big thing is what Chevy does this offseason. This is perhaps one of the biggest off seasons in Jets history, and I know I've said this for a couple of years now, but for the first time, Arniel feels like he wants to take the team in a direction that would really start to modernize how the Jets approach team building and perhaps how they, make their ice deployments and stuff. If he really has kind of learned that lesson and wants to apply that to the Jets, which we'll see perhaps with this analytics summit, I think that could be one of the biggest and most important changes to the Jets ever. There have been some moments of transition and phases that some other team staff have brought in over the years where they've moved the Jets forward in a positive way. And that's kind of, just from the words alone, that's the vibe that I get from Arniel. I'm not going to sit here and say that I can guarantee he'll do all this. I think that there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen for me to really believe in him. But I will say that when it comes to at least words that I would like to hear from a coach or something, he gave me a lot of interesting food for thought and perhaps a measure of optimism that he wants to push this franchise in a direction that's facing forward and ready for the future. And so even if the Jets are further away from a competitive state, which is very possible, I think it won't take that long for them to get back to it. If they really adopt a data science approach to things, if they really do a lot of in-depth analysis on what is going right for the team and what needs work, and if they can really be open-minded and flexible and work in the youth, I think this team won't take that long to start getting back up to being a really, really quality team. I think the Jets are perhaps far away from being a top-end contender, but they're closer than you might think. Which sounds really strange and sort of contradictory, but with how the Jets have made trades recently, with Chevy hitting home runs on most of his deals, and with Arniel seemingly interested in investing in a data department that will really help Winnipeg make the most of market inefficiencies and also kind of work around some of Winnipeg's own recruitment issues, I feel better about it. I do. Maybe in 2 to 3 years, we're looking at a really strong Jets team. I think if that's your timeline, obviously it does require some patience, and it's not ideal. I think there's the very real question of what Hellebuck's like after those next couple of years. Is he still going to be putting up Vezina caliber seasons? It's iffy. But Winnipeg will potentially have a much deeper team. They might have some of their top young players really hitting their strides in the final years of their ELCs. And the Jets might have, some new veterans and stuff in the lineup that are ready to push this team forward. Next year's Jets team, I generally get the sense that they're going to be a bubble wild card to perhaps bottom three, like bottom of the the top of the Central, right? Like the third or fourth ranked top team in the Central is kind of where I think the Jets might hover. Which again is borderline wild card territory, perhaps a little bit better. That's kind of where I see Winnipeg. It also depends on how the other teams in the Central sort of pan out. But I think without knowing what Chevy's plan is, that's where I think they are right now. Depending on what Chevy does this offseason, he could potentially accelerate the timeline a lot. I don't know if that's really going to happen, though. The Jets traditionally have been fairly limited in situations like this. The only time that they really went for broke was with the whole Dubois thing when he wanted out. So this not really being the case with this offseason, I'm very interested to see what the Jets go shopping for. Monahan going, I think, would open up a potential big need at center. Even with him, I still think the Jets needed a center. So if Winnipeg can make a really strong play and not sacrifice their whole future for it, maybe, that timeline gets accelerated by a year or two. But I think from where I'm sitting, the Jets' competitive window, it may kind of be over in some respects, but I think getting back to it won't take that long. So that's why I'm optimistic more about the future than I am next season. With Arneal's approach, if it really does live up to the hype, and if he really does, put his money where his mouth is and actually helps push this team forward, that's freaking great. I mean, I've waited for this for a long time. I think a lot of us have asked for the Jets to really change how they approach things and modernize and get into the data science stuff, because it's how a lot of the top teams have been built. Obviously there's some stuff where you can also attract top talent based on the market that you're in, but in some other cases, we've seen teams in non-traditional markets make really smart deals and put themselves in a much better, much more competitive state. So all of that to say, I'm feeling better about the future. I'm very curious to know what this offseason and upcoming year are like. That'll tell us a lot about how quick this turnaround is for the team. Make no mistake, we're kind of at a really key transition point for this franchise, and how they go forward could potentially put this team on a really fantastic path, or it could put them in a rebuilding state where the Jets maybe think much further out than we'd like. So interesting decisions upcoming. I'm excited in a way. I'm also a little nervous. I think that this is a pretty pivotal point for the franchise. I'm nervous because I really want them to set up this team for a lot of success. I think the Bones years showed us, flashes of what the Jets could be at their best. And now it's time to take the next step and get this franchise into not necessarily like the modern era, but also kind of, updating a few major things that have been a little bit outdated and some stuff that could put the Jets among the league's top and elite teams. They're not as far off as it looks right now, but there are some really big things for them to solve. And so, this is a pretty pivotal offseason, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about it. I know I've seen some comments about trading some of the young talent. I think you don't have to worry about that. I think the Jets do actually have a plan to get them in games. In fact, I'm expecting that to be a really big thing this upcoming year is ELCs that are supplementing some of the veteran depth. Perfetti is going to be there. I would imagine he's not an ELC, but he's still pretty young. So I'm going to lump him in this category. Lambert, Chibrikov, Heinola, those guys I think are all going to be really important key players. And I think that Scott, specifically went out to try and address that. Speaks a lot to how he sees what is important to this team. So that's good. I think we can probably pass on Nietzsche's. He's not nearly as good as you might think, but he's a fun player all the same. It's just I don't want the Jets to overpay him, and I think somebody else will. So lots of stuff to keep an eye out for the next few weeks. Obviously, the Ehlers question is hanging over all of us like a bit of a guillotine, but I'm sure we'll know more about that pretty soon. Let me know what you're thinking about for this offseason and give me what you're looking forward to for next year. Drop that in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's show, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and letting us waffle here tonight. But as always, have a great night and go Jets go.